Good evening. Such a great crowd for the weather we have tonight. Thank you all for coming out and spending your time with us. And good evening and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. It is my honor to serve here as the Deputy Director of both the museum and the library. We're pleased to have you with us tonight as we continue along with our fall lecture series. This evening is brought to you by a collaboration between the Ford Museum, which is part of the National Archives, and the Ford Presidential Foundation. We are very grateful to the foundation and all of you who are members of Friends of Ford and your ongoing support of that program for the research grants and public programs that you help fund, like this one. As we are taping the program and broadcasting it live on Facebook this evening, we'll ask our speaker to repeat your questions when we get to the question and answer program tonight, so people can actually hear the questions when they view this later. And again, before we get started, if you could please silence your phones and other electronic devices. Before introducing our speaker tonight, I want to go over some programs that we do have coming up here at the museum and at the library. I am sure that all of you have seen our big program that we have planned for you when you walked in here this evening, because our lobby is a giant construction zone and work in progress. We are extremely excited that we are bringing the Brenton Village train to the Ford Museum. And it will have its grand opening on December 1st. If you're more than welcome to come by and watch the process and how it's put together. So please come on back if you'd like to kind of come here every so often just to check out the process of building. It is fascinating to see the hobbyists work on the redesign and rebuild of such a famous train in this area. On December 1st, we're also excited to have a big new holiday exhibit that is also being have here as part of a collaboration between us, the City of Grand Rapids, and Downtown Rapids, Inc. It's called Light Up Downtown, and we have a lot of special events going on. Santa Claus is here for the kids, the reindeer are here for the kids, we'll have ice sculptures, and a lot of other great fun family events going on. And that begins at around 5 p.m. on December 1st, and the big lighting ceremony is at 5:30. Over at the library, we have Admiral, on November 28th, we have Admiral Michael Giorgione on his book, Inside Camp David, The Private World of the Presidential Retreat, as well as J.J. Green from WTOP Online Radio, who was the winner of the Ford Foundation Journalism for National Defense, and he will be talking about national security in threatening times. And now on to tonight's program. This evening, we have the honor of hosting Elaine Weiss, journalist and writer whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, The New York Times, and the Christian Science Monitor, as well as in reports and documentaries for the National Public Radio and Voice of America. She is the author of Fruits of Victory, The Women's Land Army of America in the Great War, which dealt with the Women's Land Army during the First World War. Tonight, however, we will be hearing about Elaine's newest book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, which was just published in March of 2018. This book is the story of how the state of Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment to our Constitution. It's important to remember that this was a 70-year process that began at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 and continued with what Elaine Weiss calls ceaseless, fearless agitation that came down to a 6-week battle in one state. Her work is based on solid archival research, but is made very approachable by the telling of the backstory in a very dramatic narrative fashion that appeals to us as general readers rather than speaking only to an academic audience. The book has received rave reviews from many sources, from the traditional reviewers in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Book Review, as well as multiple historians and readers, including Hillary Clinton. Reviews include language such as riveting and a page-turner, stirring, definitive, and engrossing by NPR, and a genteel but bare-knuckled political thriller by Mrs. Magazine. With those kinds of references, I think we're in for a most interesting presentation tonight. Please welcome Elaine Weiss to the Ford Presidential Museum.
Good evening, and thank you. I know it's snowy out there, and I appreciate your coming. I'm really delighted to be with you here on this night, and here in Grand Rapids, and especially here at the Ford Museum, because I'm going to be talking about equal rights and democracy and the Constitution, things that President Ford felt deeply about, and that's what my book is about. And yes, it's about presidents too, and you'll see how. This is a wonderful poster from Minnesota when they were fighting for women's suffrage. And I'm also here to say thank you to this museum and to museums and libraries and archives around the country who are so important. You are, for us, who are researchers and writers, you're our best friends. And you're the wellspring of knowledge for us. You cultivate those haystacks that we have to search through for those needles. So I just want to thank the Ford Museum and all those repositories around the country who I know I have relied upon. I'd also, in this talk, like to tell you a bit about Michigan's role in this amazing movement called the women's suffrage movement. And here is a picture of a suffrage float in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Isn't that great? And it's probably during one of the suffrage referenda, and I put that in plural because there were at least 4, a campaign when the question of whether women should have the most sacred right of a democracy, the vote, was being decided by men, Michigan men. Of course, only men could decide whether women deserved the vote. And I hate to tell you this, but the answer in this situation was no. Now, gradually, that answer changed to yes. And my book is the story of that evolution from no to yes. It's the story of how American women's demand for the vote, which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically and with great effort and cost made into something that was finally considered inevitable. The fight for women's suffrage really is one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. We don't often think of women's suffrage as a civil rights issue, but it truly, truly was. And it really cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who has a voice in our nation? Who can participate? When we say we the people, do we really mean everyone? And I think we're still asking those questions today. So the Women's Hour chronicles the explosive climax of this long struggle during one hot summer in Nashville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1920. It's a political thriller with strong and complex women in the starring roles, not just as historical footnotes, and a large cast of some very colorful male characters, too. It's a tale of suspense with double crosses and plot twists and betrayals. And if I've done my job, you'll forget that you know how it turns out. Now, if you're like me, and I am not a suffrage scholar, I've not spent my career studying this, you have a sort of fuzzy idea of how American women won the vote. And that active verb, won, is very important. Women were not given the vote. They were not granted the vote. They had to fight for it. And that's something that I think comes through very clearly in the book. But if you have the same sort of fuzzy image of how this happened that I do, it goes something like this. There's a group of women in hoop skirts and bonnets up in a place in New York called Seneca Falls, and they make some speeches and demands. And then fast forward, and there are a couple of picket signs, and then poof, American men see the light and grant their mothers and sisters and daughters and wives the vote. It's the march of progress. It's the natural evolution of things. It just happened. The time had been right. And it's all very natural progress. No, that's not how it happened. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working for over 72 years to win that right to vote. And the culmination of that fight came down to one 6-week fierce battle in Nashville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1920. So in the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment, and it would enter the Constitution, giving the right to vote to every woman in every state, in every election. 35 states had ratified by this summer, and 36 were needed, 3/4 of the 48 states in the nation. Tennessee could be the 36th. If the Tennessee legislature ratified the amendment, women's suffrage would become the law of the land just in time for the 1920 presidential election. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, it might be delayed for years. And in fact, the suffragists worried that it might not be enacted at all because they saw the nation drifting into a more reactionary, guarded mood. The progressive era was over. And they really felt that if they didn't get it now, they might not get it. And those of us who have lived through the agonies of the Equal Rights Amendment, which has been in Congress for almost 95 years, know that that could happen, that a constitutional amendment can get so far and not be ratified. So they really feared that. And by 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years, since that iconic meeting in Seneca Falls, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton stood up, and among her demands was the franchise for women. One of her other demands that does not get as much attention, equal pay for equal work. Not there yet. Anyway, this is part of her resolutions that she presented to the meeting. And the other women and the other attendees, there were about 300 of them in the Wesleyan Chapel, thought it was really too radical a move. It was too outrageous. They urged her to withdraw that resolution. And a man stood up in the chapel. He was 30 years old. His name was Frederick Douglass. Yes, Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls. And he said, no, you must demand the vote. It will never be given to you. Power gives nothing unless there's a demand. And he convinced them to approve the resolution. And that's why we think of Seneca Falls as one of the first organized demands for the vote. It's because of Frederick Douglass. And Douglass proudly called himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life. And he truly was. He's one of the heroes of the book. And he promotes women's suffrage through thick and thin, and you'll understand what that means when you read it, and even dies just hours after giving a speech at a women's rights convention in 1895. So in the years since Seneca Falls, the suffragists had traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony said, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. They had already waged over 900 local, state, and national campaigns for the vote. And here you see them going from wagons to cars in the course of the movement. They had to change hearts and minds before they could begin to change the laws. They had to really changed people's minds about women's role in society. It was really a deep kind of cultural change. And it really was a stupendous act, a stupendous feat of organization without any of the communication or transportation advantages that we take for granted today. When you think of it, when the movement begins in the mid-19th century, passenger train travel is really in its infancy. The telegraph has just been invented. There's no telephone, there's no typewriter. Even in 1920, when my book takes place, the radio isn't in use. And they had to organize by hand, literally, and by foot. And as one young woman in my publisher's office said when she read the manuscript, she kind of shook her head, went to my editor and said, "I don't understand how these women did it without Facebook." But they did. They held meetings everywhere. And here you see how they did it. And they rallied, and they marched, which was not considered proper for a woman to do. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did have their marching uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And here you see some wonderful pictures of women marching. It was never easy to be a suffragist. Oh, I do want to show you, sometimes they go a little overboard with the outfits. I love that one. It was never easy to be a suffragist. They had to endure contempt and ridicule in their communities, their churches, and in the press. And you're going to see some rather strong images of the anti-suffrage propaganda that was used to try to thwart the advance of women's suffrage. So here you go. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. In fact, Susan Anthony used to say she could chart the progress of the movement by the kinds of things that were thrown at her when she was at the podium. When it went from rotten eggs to just plain eggs, that was progress. And here you see some more. They are denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even Bolsheviks. And here you see, again, which do you prefer, the home or the street corner? The idea that women would go out to vote and abandon their families to do this was very strong. Here you see mom supposedly going out to vote and leaving dad with screaming babies. The apocalypse is coming. I love this one. When women vote, the marriage revised rules, men are going to have to make their own clothes out of their wives' old skirts. She's smoking a cigar. This is what's going to happen. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed she-men. And here you see images of what the suffragist looks like. Guess which one is supposedly the suffragist? The anti-suffragists were not subtle. They knew what they were warning against. And this one. The men who supported them were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. Clearly, they were frightening. And in their quest for equal citizenship, the women's movement employed a wide variety of strategies and methods. They had to, because they had to be ingenious. And many of these, marches, as we saw, demonstrations, picketing, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and legal test cases would be then adopted by the civil rights campaigns later in the 20th and even in the 21st century. So the suffragists had to be ingenious and fearless. Here's Susan Anthony, a different kind of image than we usually see of her. This is when she's younger. To test the prohibitions against women voting, Susan Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and about 150 other women actually defied the law and voted in the 1872 presidential elections. Anthony was soon arrested. Here's a cartoon showing, the subtitle is "The Woman Who Dared." And she is put on trial and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. And she goes around the nation giving lectures asking the question, is it a crime for a US citizen to vote? Something we should think about. The failure of this voting experiment in 1872 led Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment, a federal amendment which would supersede all the state laws that prohibited women from voting. It was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it stalled there for 40 years. It was voted down on the floor of the Congress or in committee 28 times. So meanwhile, the suffragists had to work in the states while continuing to try to lobby Congress. And here's this lovely cartoon. This is called Signing Their Own Declaration. And it's making fun of the suffragists, but it gives you the sense of what they were trying to do. They were trying to win their own independence. So you'll notice that in this discussion that the leaders of our nation, the leader, the presidents of the United States, haven't really come into the picture. And that's correct. Not that they were unaware of women's demands for the vote. They were getting louder and louder as the years went on. But they were being, shall we say, they were choosing to be oblivious to it. John Adams, of course, got an earful from his wife Abigail back in 1776, when she warned him that men tended to act as tyrants and that he needed to remember the ladies when creating this new democratic republic. But he ignored her in that. And for the next century, most presidents ignored the issue or made sanctimonious pronouncements opposing women getting the vote. And here you see, this is Life magazine showing Susan Anthony trying to assassinate the leaders of the nation with her umbrella. She's often portrayed with this threatening umbrella. The suffragists confronted the presidents, but they often squirmed away. Here's another picture of Susan Anthony going after President Grover Cleveland. President William Howard Taft denounced the idea of women getting the vote, even though his own daughter, who was a PhD in history had a PhD in history from Yale and was dean of Bryn Mawr College, was an active suffrage leader. And then there's Theodore Roosevelt, who actually changed his mind about the matter. He was at first ambivalent, but by 1912, when he was running for the presidency again on the Bull Moose Party ticket, he'd become an outspoken advocate for women's suffrage. But of course, he suffered at the hands of political cartoonists. This shows him knocking on the door. It's called The Militant Recruit. And that's Teddy with flowers, supposedly trying to court the woman's vote in the 1912 election. And then there's this one, which I had never seen before, but I was really excited to see. Look at this. I'm ready for Teddy. But it was Woodrow Wilson who really found himself in the crosshairs when it came to women's suffrage, because he's president when it all comes to a head. He was personally and politically opposed to women having the vote, though his daughters were both active suffragists. But he was being slowly worked upon, shall we say. And he was being convinced by some of the more traditional suffragists. They were really working on him to try to slowly cajole him into the idea of supporting a constitutional amendment. But he also became the target of the more militant suffragists who picketed him. You see Wilson against women. President Wilson wants us to wait. He was being vilified for his lack of support for women's rights. And eventually, again, here we go, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? This is at the gates of the White House. And here he's being called Kaiser Wilson. This is during wartime. This is while we're engaged in the Great War. And this was considered treasonous. And we'll get to what happened to these women for doing this. But again, they are saying, how can we be fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy when half of our own nation cannot vote, are not part of that democracy? So they're asking an essential question. Eventually, he did come around to supporting votes for women, but only if granted by the states. He believed in states' rights. He didn't believe that Washington should tell the states what to do. So here he is, I intend to vote for women's suffrage. This was when his home state of New Jersey was voting on it in 1915. And it was defeated. He knew it was going to be defeated, so it was a kind of safe thing for him to do. But he does eventually come around for a whole complex set of reasons to supporting the federal amendment. And here's a cartoon of him as the fairy godmother giving women the vote. Now, in the decades that the federal amendment was stalled in Congress, those 40 years, and the suffs went to work in the states, which can grant suffrage to their citizens, including here in Michigan. So here is a picture of the Grange. The Grange was actually very, in almost every community, was very supportive of women's rights and advocated for women's suffrage. Michigan had a long and kind of complicated relationship to women's suffrage. Back in 1846, 2 years before Seneca Falls, Ernestine Rose spoke to the Michigan legislature about the need for women's suffrage. And in 1849, this is really early, a Senate committee led by Senator Robinson of Ada proposed a universal suffrage amendment, but it was not acted upon because the legislature said, because of the unusualness and needlessness of the franchise for women, they didn't need it. In 1866, the state's first bill on women's suffrage advanced to the legislature and was defeated by just one vote, so it's getting closer. In 1870, a bill giving women the vote went all the way to the governor's office, but he vetoed it. And here's this really intriguing image that I found. This was called the suffrage train, and it says, this is what, the placard in the engine there says, this is what could happen with women's suffrage. And it shows the women are the engineers and the conductors and the, taking all the leadership roles in the train, and the men have brooms and wash basins and are carrying the babies. So this was kind of giving a warning of what might happen as seen through a certain lens. So the suffragists tried again in 1874. This time, the bill died in the legislature. Women tried to convince the 1908 Constitutional Convention to take out the word male from the Constitution. That didn't go anywhere. In 1912 and 1913, votes for women was on the ballot again, but the men of Michigan voted it down. Here's another float trying to convince them. Finally, well, here's another actually great picture. This is at the state fair. And here's the women's suffrage tent. Come in and get a cookie and learn why you should support women's rights. Finally, in 1918, November, just before the armistice, and here's this wonderful photograph of soldiers in Michigan who had fought for democracy. These banners are carried in Grand Rapids, and they say, "Let our mothers vote," among other things. So here are soldiers holding up these banners to convince the men of Michigan to allow women to vote. And this time, it does go through. And of course, women had assumed extraordinary roles in the war that they'd never taken up before. And this really convinced, it was hard to argue that women didn't deserve the vote, that they hadn't been patriotic, that they hadn't been full citizens. So you see this movement happen right after the war. So it goes on the ballot here in Michigan, and here's an example. This was sort of a sample ballot. Notice a very helpful hint how you can vote no on the prepared ballot. I thought that was quite interesting. But during those years of frustration, with the slow pace of progress, both in Congress and in the states, the suffrage movement bogged down and split. And this often happens in social movements. We see it in the labor movement, in all kinds of civil rights movements. There's a difference of opinion between those who want to stay the course and do what they've been doing, keep going at it, and those who want to use more radical and confrontational tactics. And so a young Quaker woman from New Jersey named Alice Paul breaks off from the mainstream suffrage organization, and she wants to take a new tack and new tactics that have never been used in America before. She stages demonstrations on the steps of the US Capitol. Her workers begin picketing the White House, at the gates of the White House, never been done before by man or woman. Here they are: "No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex," quoting Susan Anthony. And they are arrested. Hundreds, 500 women who picketed are arrested on bogus charges like obstructing the sidewalk. And they serve time in jail for their civil disobedience. They're held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells. And, whoops, we're moving too fast. Okay, here they are. They're physically assaulted, they're clubbed, they're tied to the wall. They're not allowed to read or write or even speak to one another. They communicate by singing. One suffrage leader is held in manacles with her arms over her head for days on end. Alice Paul is kept in solitary confinement and is threatened with commitment to a mental institution. They were playing hardball. When they refused to eat, they were force-fed with tubes rammed down their noses. When they were released, they participated in one of the great public relations gimmicks of all time. They toured the country on what was called the Prison Special. They took a Pullman car, and it went across the country, northern and southern routes, and they are in tailor-made recreations of their prison uniforms. And they give speeches and hold rallies all across the country, showing Americans, we are your wives, your mothers, your daughters, and we were imprisoned and we were tortured for demanding the vote. And this has a real impact on public opinion. Here they are: resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. And it was a very, very effective public relations effort. So finally, in June of 1919, the 19th Amendment wins approval from both houses of Congress, and it's sent to the states for ratification. And Michigan steps up, and they're the third state to ratify. You should be very proud. My home state of Maryland never ratified. By the summer of 1920, a year later, the amendment was on the cusp of victory, or perhaps defeat, because Tennessee was a dangerous place to stage this last definitive battle for women's suffrage. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the amendment, and all for the same racist rationale. They did not want Black women to vote. So the suffragists knew that they faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville, and the campaign generals arrived. Some of these were a little, in white gloves and picture hats. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the premier suffrage association in the country, 2 million members. She's also head of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance. Remember, this is a worldwide movement at this point. America is only the 26th nation to grant its women the vote. We were not in the lead at all. 26th before us, so we're probably 27th. She comes down, Carrie comes down from New York headquarters to lead the strategy and the campaign for ratification. She is the protege of Susan B. Anthony, who chose her to lead the movement into the 20th century. Arriving that same night in the summer of 1920 was Sue Shelton White, who's 32 years old, represents that third generation of suffragists who've grown impatient. They don't want to ask anymore. They're going to demand the vote. And she breaks off from Carrie Catt's wing of the party and joins Alice Paul and is arrested for burning Woodrow Wilson's words in effigy, serves time in prison, and is sent home to run the Women's Party campaign for the vote. So you have two suffrage organizations in the same hotel, but they're running separate but parallel campaigns to win ratification. And then there's Josephine Pearson, leader of the Tennessee anti-suffrage women, who promised her dying mother that she would fight the scourge of women's suffrage if it ever came to her home state. And she arrives from her home in the southern mountains of Tennessee to defend her state against what she calls the feminist peril. So they're joined by more than 1,000 men and women who enter the fray, because there are powerful forces working against ratification in Nashville. Political, corporate, and ideological foes who each have their own reasons for opposing women getting the vote. Politicians who feared that this new unpredictable voting bloc, 27 million women would be eligible to vote, and no one knew how they were going to vote. So they really feared this voting, these unknown voters coming into play. Clergymen who believed that women voting went against the plan of God because he had made Adam to be dominant over Eve, and to question that was against God's will. And so they used biblical arguments to fight against women's suffrage. Corporations that believed that women voting would be bad for business. We don't think about that. But for instance, the textile manufacturers didn't want women voting because they feared that if mothers voted, they might want to abolish child labor. And they relied on child labor. It was cheap. So they didn't want women anywhere near that ballot box. Likewise, the liquor industry, which was very strong in Michigan and is credited with defeating all those referenda that we talked about. Now, prohibition is already in effect in the summer of 1920, but what they're hoping is that if they can keep women away from choosing candidates and choosing their legislators, that maybe it won't be enforced. It'll just sort of be wink and a nod, and it won't be enforced. So they're trying to keep women from the ballot box. And the liquor lobby sponsors a speakeasy, remember, prohibition is in effect, a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel where everyone is staying in Nashville. And actually, I was just there last night, and 2 nights ago. They dispense liquor morning, noon, and night to any legislator who will toddle up there and listen to their reasoning of why they should vote against the ratification. So there are these very hilarious scenes of legislators dead drunk, bouncing off the walls, and they have to be thrown into the showers before they can go into the vote. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women would oppose their own enfranchisement really shocked me when I found this in my research. And some of these antis, as they were called, were sophisticated and very well-educated women. Josephine Pearson, the head of the Tennessee antis, is actually a college dean and college professor. Others, this will kind of surprise you, Ida Tarbell, the very famous muckraker who single-handedly brought down John D. Rockefeller and the Oil Trust with her articles for McClure's magazine. You know, one of the most famous journalists in the world at this point does not support women getting the vote, and in fact becomes an officer of the anti-suffrage movement. And then, this is always the one that people gasp, Eleanor Roosevelt. No, she is not an anti-suffragist, but she is not a supporter. She is not a supporter of the movement. She's, at this point, a 35 or 36-year-old, kind of insecure mother of 5 little children. Her husband is running for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920. She's not sure if she should have any opinions, she later says, and it's really, she's so ambivalent that the anti-suffragists try to court her to join them. And in New York, women actually get the vote and can vote for the first time in 1918, but she refuses to vote. So her political education begins very quickly, and she will soon join the League of Women Voters, become a protege of Carrie Catt, and you'll see her take off. But at this point, she is very unsure. So again, what we have to understand is that many women feared that women taking on this role, entering the political sphere, leaving what was called the domestic sphere, leaving home, was going to endanger the American family and endanger American civilization. I mean, the anti-suffragists really say this is going to be the downfall of civilization. And what they really fear is that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy change in gender roles. I mean, that's what those propaganda cartoons were all about. It would endanger the American home. It would alter private life, not just public life. And in that way, it's an important reminder that the fight about suffrage was never just a political issue. It was a social and cultural, and for some, a moral issue. It was a precursor to what we now call the culture wars. So it had layers of emotional meaning that made it very complicated and, again, very volatile. So all sides come to Nashville, and all hell breaks out. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings, fistfights, betrayal and courage. The newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. And the outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. I won't spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. Now, all of this took place almost a century ago, but I think you'll find that The Woman's Hour is a book of history with surprising and even unnerving modern themes. And I'm just going to show you again some of the kinds of propaganda that were being, or advocacy, we could call it, advocacy for voting no. Home-loving women. You know, if you're a home-loving woman, you're not going to want to have the vote. And this is actually one of my favorite propaganda elements. This is America When Feminized, and it shows a rooster and a hen, and the hen has a Votes for Women sash, and she's marching off the nest, and the rooster calls back, "Ma, you better come back, the eggs are gonna get cold." And she calls back, "Sit on 'em yourself, old man, my country calls me." And the tagline, one of many are there, but the tagline is, "A vote for the federal amendment is a vote for organized female nagging forever." I want to get a bumper sticker. So again, I think this is a book of history, but in some ways it explains both where we've been, how difficult this decision was for the nation, and also where we are today. It deals with topics that dominate our headlines right now: voter rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, and racism. Because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is flown in defiance. This is a picture of Josephine Pearson on your right, at the opening of the anti-suffrage headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel. And between the two anti-suffrage leaders is the oldest Confederate veteran alive at that time. And there's all kinds of symbols and meanings in this that Tennesseans and Southerners would understand. Again, we've certainly been seeing echoes of all of this recently. On Election Day 2016, I learned a lesson about the powerful legacy of the suffragists. Thousands of women went to cast their vote. If you'll remember, there was a woman running for the presidency that year. And then they made pilgrimages to the grave sites of the suffragists, the women in my book, who had won the vote for them. They placed flowers, they've placed flowers and thank you notes and their I voted stickers on the grave of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Catt in New York City, on the grave of Alice Paul in New Jersey, and at Susan B. Anthony's grave in Rochester. More than 10,000 men, women, and children came to her grave to thank her for winning the vote. I think there are important lessons to be learned from the fight for women's suffrage. That social change is slow and political change is hard. That reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is inspiring, but it's also a cautionary tale. There are moral compromises made to win success, to achieve success. And the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It wasn't won in 1920, and it's certainly not over now. I hope that the story of the Woman's Hour will teach a new generation that voting is important and that making positive change requires patience and persistence. The idea that protest, the suffragists did protest, and it is patriotic, and it is necessary, but it must be followed up by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and picket. They debated they lobbied, they campaigned, and they drafted legislation. And they didn't rest after the 19th Amendment was won. Carrie Catt established the League of Women Voters, and here is their first campaign poster. And Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced into Congress in 1923. And let's see, I think this picture kind of got out of order. So I'm going to go back just so I can show you this. And First Lady Betty Ford, somehow it kind of dropped out of order. First Lady Betty Ford is here campaigning for ratification of the ERA in, I believe it's 1974. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And today, I think it's our responsibility to protect the vote for all citizens. And it's our sacred duty to use the vote, which I hope and I expect all of you did last week, to improve our democracy. That's what I've learned from the suffragists, and I hope you enjoy reading about them. Thank you very much. Questions? I'd love to hear questions. Questions, please. Yes.
So you noted that the women's suffragist movement penetrated both of the public and the personal life.
Yes.
I'm curious to know if the birth rate declined during the movement.
Well, okay, I'm going to repeat that question. Since the suffrage movement did involve both perceived changes to both public and personal life, was there a dip in the birth rate during the movement? I don't know that answer exactly, but I think there may have been, because this is also a time when women are going to work. They are entering the workforce in increasing numbers at the turn of the century into 1920. And it's also the time when Margaret Sanger is working to try to convince the powers that be that women need control over their reproductive lives in order to be able to have healthier families and also to be able to work if they choose to. It's one of the interesting things that the suffrage movement, as a movement, declines to support Margaret Sanger. Not that individual suffragists don't support and believe what she's doing is very important, but because it's too controversial. And they decide that they will not get involved in that fight. They're going to keep their eye on the prize. And it's one of the very interesting compromises that they make. So that's a really good question. Thank you. Yes, I'll take the first one and then the second.
In the film Iron-Jawed Angels, there was a character who was working with Alice Paul, and her husband threatened and followed through on taking the children away from her because women did not have automatic custody, the men controlled them. Was that a common thing?
Yes, I can't say. I think they may have kind of invented that character at the time, but certainly that was an issue. That was an issue at Seneca Falls. It's very interesting for us to try to wrap our heads around what the rights women didn't have in the mid-19th century. Now, this changes as the years go on because a lot of it is state law, and part of the suffrage movement is agitating at the state level to change the laws in their home states. But when this begins, not only could women not vote, but they had no rights over their children. They had no custodial rights. The husband owned the children if there was a divorce or any other separation. They did not have property rights. If they inherited land, it'd be, again, married women had it worse than single women. So a married woman's property went to her husband. If she had any wages from some handiwork or something, that went to her husband. She could not testify in a court of law. She could not, of course, serve on a jury. She could not bring civil suit. She is, what Elizabeth Cady Stanton calls civilly dead. She's really chattel. She belongs to her husband. So yes, that was absolutely true. Whether that was true in 1920 I think you're talking about, well, I don't know which character they were trying to, but whether it was true in that state, I can't tell you. But that certainly was an issue for women. Yeah. Yes, behind.
In Grand Rapids, we had a publisher here in about 1910 that published a series of about 25 postcards advocating women's suffrage.
Wow.
All had little slogans on it.
Really? Oh, I'd love to see them.
Our library is trying to collect them all, but right now we only have 12 of them.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about that. That would be great. Yeah, Grand Rapids was clearly one of the hubs of activity in the state. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Wasn't there some discussion with Alice Paul and the people around her about whether they wanted to have just white women vote? Wasn't there some controversy of whether they wanted to include African American?
Well, this is a whole part of the history. The racial aspect of the history was something I was not prepared for and was really struck by. But racism pervades the whole history. It's mostly on the anti-suffrage side, who especially in the southern states, where they warn you don't want black women to be able to vote. Black men can legally vote, but we've kept them away from the ballot box with intimidation and Jim Crow laws and lynchings and literacy tests and poll taxes. In the movement, it's a very complicated relationship, and I think what there's a story about the 1913 Great March on Washington, where thousands of women, it's the first really big suffrage parade, national, from all over the country. Delegations come. And Alice Paul is the organizer of that. And Ida B. Wells, the great suffrage and civil rights leader and journalist who has chronicled the lynchings, the epidemic of lynchings in America, and founded the first black women's suffrage club in Chicago called the Alpha Club. So she comes down as part of the suffrage contingent from Illinois and wants to march. And there are differing accounts, but she's sort of told to march with the black sororities in the back of the parade. And she says, no, I'm not going to do that. And she kind of bursts in and marches with the Illinois delegation, who embraces her. So again, it's complicated. You can say, yes, she was told not to march, and then she marches, but she was embraced by her. But there is racism on a personal or an institutional level all throughout. And then there are, great champions. So it's a complicated, as America is complicated, it's a complicated question, but that's really true, and you've hit one of the threads that I think we have to grapple with. Yes, sir.
Did the 19th Amendment cover American territories at all?
That's interesting. I think it did, because I know Alaska and Hawaii, I think the women were able to vote they weren't part of the Union yet, but they could vote in their territories. I believe it does in Guam. I think it does. But I should look that up and make sure, but I think it does. And again, the 19th Amendment is totally race neutral. It says the right to vote shall not be abridged by any of the states, and it gives it to all women in all states. It does not make any color line. The way it is implemented, especially in the southern states with Jim Crow laws, is the problem. Yes?
You talked about the arrests and the jailing of suffragettes here in the United States. The suffragettes movement in other countries were, for example, in the UK, were exceedingly violent, to the point where women and men were killed. Did that ever happen in the
No.
United States, or was it mostly all peaceful protests?
Right, so it's, Alice Paul brings the ideas of the Pankhurst, the more radical, they're called militants there, and they are militant. The death is the woman who gets run over by the horse. But it's mostly property damage, but they do set off bombs and they crack store windows and things like that. So it definitely is militant. Alice Paul was a Quaker, and it's never militant here. There is never violence. The most violent thing is that they hold up a picket sign in front of the White House. And I'm going to give you a little lexicon lesson, which is in America, they are not suffragettes. They are in the more radical wing in Great Britain is called suffragettes. It's that term, and I think it's Mary Poppins who has kind of gotten us all using that. It's a term that is invented by a journalist for the Daily Mail, for the Mail in London in 1906 to make fun of the militant suffragists. So he uses that diminutive et to kind of, make fun of them. They, in turn, the radical suffragists there, embrace it and say, okay, if you're going to call us that, we're going to call ourselves that. And they kind of, own it. It never happens in America. And even Alice Paul does not call herself a suffragette. So I do not call the American women suffragettes ever. So they're suffragists. So I have to do this every time. But that is the technical difference. But no, it is never, ever violent here. Yes, sir.
What, if anything, do we see in the election behavior of the anti-suffragists, 2, 3, 4 presidential election cycles out after ratification?
That's a wonderful question. And it's fascinating because, and I deal with this in the afterword, most of the women take up the vote and use it. And even Josephine Pearson comes up with an ingenious way of having men vote for her. It's really wild. But one of the fascinating things I found in pursuing it beyond 1920 is that the anti-suffragists learned how to organize in their organizations, and they actually become stronger. Where the suffragists dissipate, the big tent is gone, they've achieved their goal, each group of women take on their different causes, and that could be, peace or public health, or they each go in their own direction. The anti-suffragists coalesce, and you see it begin to happen in Nashville, where they're accusing the suffragists of being Bolsheviks, being, foreign, controlled by foreign powers. And so they continue this, and they accuse Carrie Catt and Jane Addams and other suffragists who were also pacifists, who are personal pacifists, and accuse them of being communists. And this continues on into the McCarthy era. You really see it. And so I believe we see the roots of a strong conservative women's organization begin with the anti-suffrage movement and continue to this day. I mean, very good at training the new generation. Phyllis Schlafly comes out of this, this generations of movement. It's really, really interesting. So in fact, they take this vote that's been foisted upon them, as they call it, and they use it. It's really fascinating. So that's another great question. Yes?
I just like to tell fellow Grand Rapidians that for 30 years in this city, there's been an organization called the Greater Grand Rapids Women's Street Foundation. And if you're not aware of it, please look us up. We know a lot about how much a hub Grand Rapids was. In fact, in 1899, the national movement met here at St. Cecilia's. We will be sitting on stage. We know a lot more, which we're trying to get out. And in 2020, we can celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment with us. But yes, there's a great long history.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think Joel has mentioned that the book is going to be adapted into a limited TV series by Steven Spielberg's company. So we're just beginning that. Actually, I go to California on Sunday. And so that's going to be really interesting. Interesting experience. But again, this is a story that, I just wonder, how many people knew about what happened or that anything happened in Nashville? Okay, great. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, even people in Nashville don't know it. That's what I find fascinating. It's just a story that we do not hear about.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more. You were saying that you thought World War I was so influential and helped to make the turning point. But I was wondering, from your perspective, it seems like women won a lot of rights because they lost so many men. They had to change their society to adopt all the, what they call the surplus women, because they no longer had the men to escort them because the men didn't come back from the war. I don't think that was the same situation here in the United States.
Correct.
But I'm wondering how much, when the government went out and specifically tried to catalog all of women's skills at the beginning of World War I in order to be able to utilize
Yep.
them, did that moving them into those things, did any of that, was that a turning point? Like, what was it?
Yeah, well, you're very right. It's a different situation. In fact, in Great Britain, they've just celebrated their centennial this year in 18, because Parliament gave women the right to vote, but it only gave certain women the right to vote, and it had to do with the war. Women had to be landowners or taxpayers, and that meant that was the kind of class society in England, which we don't have here. But it also, you had to be 30 years old. And I thought, why? I mean, is that considered mature? And then I learned that the reason that the Parliament put that in is they had lost over 1 million men in World War I. And if they had allowed all women over 21 to vote, they felt there'd be too many women voting and not enough men. And so it wasn't for another decade, 1928, when women over 21 get the vote. Here, it is what women did in the war. We didn't lose that many, so not many men. So it's what women did and how they stepped up to their patriotic duty. And the suffragists pumped out. They had a whole public relations office in Washington and New York pumping out stories about how women contributed to the war effort. So that's how it begins to change both congressional opinion and public opinion. Yes?
I noticed in the book that there was a reproduction of a map showing which states had ratified, which states hadn't yet. And the farther west you go, west in the Midwest ratified very quickly, and New England, which has been a hotbed of abolitionism and now we associate more with more progressive views, wasn't in there.
No.
What did you see as the social factors that affected
Right.
the West ratifying fast and New England?
It's not even just in ratification, it's in according suffrage by state. And so you see it happen in the West, Wyoming being the first, 1869, and they allowed women to vote even when they were a territory. So when they applied for statehood, and again, there's this pioneer spirit, and women are partners with men in building the society out there. And so they apply for statehood, and Congress says, yeah, okay, fine, but we don't allow women to vote, so you can't do that. And there's this beautiful letter that the territorial governor writes and says, we would stay out of the Union for 100 years if we can't bring our women with us. Now, part of it was, again, the sense that they are partners with us. It was also an immigration tactic. It was a promotion because they needed women. And they were hoping this would get women there. So the first states to grant women the vote are in the West. Wyoming, Montana, Colorado. Then it goes to the West Coast and California and Washington and Oregon. Then the Midwest. And the New England states are like a lost cause. They are really conservative. And they also have corporate interests that are keeping them from doing it. So there's all kinds of interesting reasons. And again, we think of suffrage in its own little bubble and its own little silo, but it's impacted by all of these very strong political and social and cultural movements. And so that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just this one little bubble floating in isolation.
One last question, if there's any more. Well, Elaine,
Okay,
thank you very much.
thank you. My pleasure. for me.
So thank you for being here. I think it was just an absolutely fabulous lecture. Thank you for coming here. This is just a little token of our esteem.
Thank you.
A Gerald R. Ford presidential pen set, which hopefully you'll use out in
Oh,
the
yes,
lobby to
absolutely.
sign the many books that you'll sell tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. I will use that.
Again, we really appreciate you coming out tonight for this program and all the others. If you've been here in the past or will come in the future, we look forward to seeing you here for our future events, beginning with, of course, our December event, and as well as our winter events coming up, which we'll be advertising soon. We invite you to please enter the lobby and get your book signed, or have a cookie and a cup of coffee, and have a great evening. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming out.
Thank you.